to talk today about playing through changes, but specifically playing over 2-5-1s. So 2-5-1s are really like the building blocks of jazz. Are really, really common chord progressions, particularly in tunes that we come to know as standards or traditional jazz. That's essentially bebop and hard bop, so 40s, 50s, and even sort of mid-60s jazz. The thing with a 2-5-1 to understand is you do need to know what each of the chords is going to be. You need to know the notes, and minor 2-5-1s are slightly different to major 2-5-1s. Today I'm going to focus more on a major 2-5-1, but the principles can still be applied to a minor 2-5-1. And I'm not giving you rules or anything, I'm just letting you know how I think about improvising over these things, and hopefully that will make it a little bit easier for you, because sometimes a thing that I've said in previous videos is that some books have made it more confusing when I was reading them when I was younger. They would be theoretically correct, but it would just be a lot of stuff to try and process, particularly in the moment of actually improvising. So for those who are unfamiliar with the term 2-5-1, what that refers to is the second degree of a scale. So if we're in the key of C, it would be the note D. You can build a chord off that based on stacked thirds. So diatonically, if you build a chord off the second degree of a C major scale, you end up with a D minor chord. So it would sound like that. Now in jazz, they usually add a seventh as well, so it's not just D minor triad. It'd be a D minor 7, and then often they'll add a ninth as well, so you can add a 13th, and if you want, an 11th. Now the fifth refers to the fifth degree of a C major scale, which in this case would be a G, and that happens to naturally form a dominant 7th chord, which resolves perfectly to a C major chord. In this case, again, it would be a C major 7, because jazz is essentially a 7th chord idiom. Everything is played as a 7th chord. So in my video that I did on creating lines over dominant 7th chords, where I talked about knowing the notes in the chord, the principles of that are essentially the same here. You do need to know the notes of the chord. You really should know them in all 5 cage positions if you want to be able to play all over the fretboard. I'm not going to focus so much on that. I will do a video soon on playing over minor chords, and all of the information on that can be applied over any minor chord, whether it's a 2 chord, a 3 chord, or 1 chord, doesn't really matter. But today I just want to talk about the concept of playing over or through changes. I know Josh Smith, fantastic Los Angeles blues jazz guitarist, talks about playing through changes, and I think he really hits the nail on the head when he talks about how the goal of a good improviser, often in jazz, but sometimes in country as well, is to really guide the listener through the changes, not to just sort of surf over the top of the changes. So when it comes to playing a 2-5-1, there are a couple of different ways you can do it. There's more than one way to skin a cat. You can theoretically just play the essential notes of each chord, and that will sound great. You could just play the notes in the arpeggio, and I would recommend doing that if you've never played over moving chords before, then that's a really, really good way to get a handle on how notes resolve and what the essential notes of each chord are. Once you can do that, we can start to embellish it a little bit. So in this case, the notes over D are going to be D, F, A, and C. They're your essential notes. Over G, it's going to be G, B, D, and F. And over C, it's going to be C, E, G, and B. So with that, I would try and find it, at least pick one position and find where all of those different notes are. So with your, say for example, your 2 chord would be. So they're all of the sort of essential notes with 1 or 2 extensions I can play over an F that I've worked out, because I've got an F here, there's an A, there's a C, there's an F, there's an E, which is the 9, there's an A, there's a C, there's an E, there's the tonic, there's an F. So there's nothing wrong with what I played then if I was vamping over a D minor chord. Same Same thing with the G. And then over the C. So you could say, if you had a 2-5-1 that goes over 4 bars, you would have D, then to G, then 2 bars of C. So you could be thinking D minor, G, then C, D minor, D to G, C, D minor, G, C, D, so forth. That's a really good way to spell out the chords. Now, I didn't play anything that was super interesting then, but it was very strong harmonically. I outlined everything. And hopefully you could hear that even though I didn't have an accompanist. And that's ultimately the end goal, is to be able to spell out chord progressions and what's happening harmonically without having an accompanist. Then you can start to put in notes from scales. So I could put in some lines from a D minor scale. That would work, and then I could link it with lines from a G. Then to C lines. Here's a revelation. The D minor scale, the G scale, and the C major scale are all the same scale. They're just highlighting different notes. So the notes that I'm using are C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and then C again. It's just that over a D minor chord, you'd often start on the D and go up to a D. The G, you would start on a G, and then go to a G, and the C, you would start on a C and go to a C. That, I don't think in terms of modes when I improvise, but it just naturally happens that the scale is the same, but there's a reordering because the notes in the arpeggio are different for each chord. So what I would recommend doing, I find a lot of modal theory and modal thinking unnecessarily confusing, and it just removes you from the essential thing you're supposed to do, which is making music. So what I would encourage you to do is think about the notes in the chord and then fill it out with scale notes, either diatonic or chromatic. And that's a more straightforward way of approaching the essential components of a chord, rather than thinking I have to play D Dorian, then I have to go to G Mixolydian, then I have to go to C Ionian. That when you think like that, I find that you do a slight disservice as a guitar player, and you just think in these strict, pure scale sort of mindsets, and it can detach you from playing the strong notes in the actual chord, or knowing what the strong notes are, and it can affect the melody. It can tend to meander a bit, like theoretically everything I played there is correct, but I don't know if you would be able to tell really what I was playing in terms of the chords, and it waffled. It didn't sound very strong. So that's one thing that I would think about. The next thing you can do is you can put chromatic approach lines in. That's totally cool. And enclosures, so you could get stuff like and singing everything you do. That's a really good thing too, because it just gets your ear locked into what it is that you want to play or what you want to articulate. Another approach you can do is you can use chord substitutions. Now this is a really exciting thing. In jazz, any chord can be turned into a dominant seventh chord, and any dominant seventh chord can be turned into an altered chord, and any dominant seventh chord can be substituted for a tritone substitution. So what I'm essentially saying there is that D minor doesn't have to be a D minor. That D minor could become a D7 chord because it's now becoming the 5 of G. So I could play D7 lines instead of D minor. Now, if I was playing in the context of, say, a guitar trio where it's just me doing all the harmonic and the melodic stuff and a bass player, I have free rein because there's no chordal player that is hammering away at a D minor chord. If I'm playing in the context where there is a band and they are playing a D minor chord, then I have to be careful with that sort of, I have the right to do what I just explained, but I have to be careful about how I do it, because if I'm just hammering away at a D7 endlessly while the band's playing a D minor, it's not going to sound great. So I might choose in the last beat or two of the D minor bar to turn it into a D7 chord to intensify that resolution to G. So I could do something like this. That would work. Then to G. Same thing, I could turn the D7 chord, I could go D minor then into a D altered chord. Like, that would also work like that. But that's something that you just have to think about the context of, is there a band playing with you, and how frequently is, if it's a keyboard player, are they playing chords all the time? Are they very sparse? You might want to have a conversation with them. You say like, hey, when I'm soloing, don't comp. I'll do it. You could just do stabs like that kind of thing. But theoretically, you can do that. You can turn any chord into a dominant seventh chord, and any dominant seventh chord into an altered chord. And then you could tritone substitute that. So that would mean in this case, your D becomes an A flat. So if you want to get a little bit more out there, a little bit more modern, then you could play A flat 7 licks, because then the gravitational pull down to a G is very strong. Like that kind of thing. Having said that, when you get to the actual 5 chord, which is a G, that's going to sound super hip if you turn that into an altered chord, because again, it's going to make that resolution even stronger. So you could end up with this sort of line. So you could have lines that go. And you can hear when there's that 5. Now, guys like Bird and other really legendary bop players would often turn it into a flat 9 chord, which is a version of a dominant 7th chord. It has a diminished sound, but it's really functioning as a dominant 7th. And an altered chord, I sort of see flat 9s and altereds, in my mind, they're just interchangeable. Theoretically, they're not the same thing, and I will do a video on flat 9s and dominant 7ths, but as far as I'm concerned, I try and take relatively complex information, theoretical information, and just make it very straightforward. And in my mind, I just see them as they're the same. I can just interchange between the two, and I always do. And most of the time, I don't really have any problem with that in terms of clashing with what's around me. And at the end of the day, if you resolve your line correctly, you can kind of justify playing anything. You could just play a bar of random notes, but if you land on a strong beat and a strong note, then it will work out okay. The other thing that you can think about when you're playing over 2 5s, and this is something that I heard Joe Pass, for those who are not familiar with him, check him out, one of the greatest jazz guitar players of all time. And there's a lot of videos of him teaching. He was a good teacher, but one of the things I heard him say, and this was when I was like a teenager, he said, the 2 is the same as the 5, so forget about the 2. And I didn't really understand what he was talking about for a while, until it dawned on me that if you look at a dominant 7th chord, say a G7 chord, and if you turn that into a G7 sus4, a G7 sus4 chord is the same as a D minor chord, it just has a G in the bass. So a sus4 resolution has the same harmonic function as a 2/5. If I do that with the bass notes changing, that's the only difference. It's a little bit clearer that way. Now, what that means as an improviser is that means that you could then choose to forget about thinking about the D minor altogether and just play G7 licks. Because G7 licks, if the 2 chord is the same as the 5, then they will work. And you might end up playing a couple of notes that are slightly weaker over the D minor, but then the resolution when you get to the G7 is going to be stronger. And so you can get away with that. It also means when you want to learn a lot of jazz standards, I'm sure a lot of people have looked at a jazz standard, whether it's All the Things You Are or Have You Met Miss Jones, and realize like, wow, there's a lot of chords in this. If you can identify all of the 2/5s, whether they resolve or not doesn't really matter, and you take out the 2 from the equation, you might be taking out a third of all of the chords in the song you have to worry about. That frees up a lot of mental space for you to focus on your playing or your lines. So I don't have a hard and fast rule that I use when I'm improvising. Sometimes I really want to outline specifically a D minor chord before it goes to a G, and I will think of a D minor chord. Well, when I'm improvising, I don't consciously think, but this sort of happens subconsciously. But I might really want to outline it. Sometimes I might want to turn it into a dominant 7 chord like I did. Sometimes an altered chord. And other times I will just go, no, I'm just going to play G7 licks. And then maybe I'll turn the G into an altered chord so it sounds like there is some kind of progress happening over that chord. Doesn't sound too static. But you might find that when you're doing arpeggios based off the G7 chord, that some of those arpeggios will just naturally outline a D minor 7 chord. So if you do an arpeggio starting on the 5th degree of a G, so if you played that lick, the first 4 notes of that were a D minor 7 chord. So I was only thinking about the G7 there, but when playing G7 notes, I inadvertently played a 2/5-1 resolution. D minor 7, then a flat 9, like that. So there's lots of different things that you can do with this, and I would encourage you to just sit down and try this in different keys and different positions. Most of today's examples I've done in the key of, I've done them all in the key of C, except the introduction was in F. I did a 1-6-2-5 turnaround in the key of F to just, kick the video off. But for the actual lesson, I've been dealing with C, and I've been working out of the caged position, the caged A position, like that. So let's play like a couple of times through to end this video on the D minor, G, and C 2/5 of just 4 bars. And I might do another video looking at different ways of playing 2/5s before we get into turnarounds, 3-6-2-5 substitutions, and then linking 2/5s or seemingly unrelated 2/5s. 1, 2, 3, 4.